Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the HRC series Meet VCU Authors. In partnership with VCU Libraries, our Meet VCU Authors series invites members of the Richmond community, as well as colleagues and students from VCU and other local universities, to meet VCU authors as they talk about their recently published books and answer questions about their work. Although we still can't meet in person this semester due to public health concerns, we look forward to recognizing our amazing VCU authors in the College of Humanities and Sciences and beyond in this format before we can resume our talks in person. Before I forget again, I'd like to give a big shout out to Tyler Conrad, who is our Director of Events in the college, whose support and execution of HRC events from registration to everything else this year has been considerable, especially as we are still waiting to hire an assistant at the HRC. Tyler and the communications team in the college have been essential in ensuring that our robust programming continues. So thank you, Tyler, and thank you all for supporting the HRC by showing up, by asking questions, by becoming involved in our initiatives and projects as the HRC strives this year to become a university-wide research center. Our speaker today is Professor Faye Belgrave, who will speak with us about her most recent book titled African American Families, Research, Theories, and Practice, co-written with Trinette Clark-Goings and Heather Jones, and published in January this year by Cognella Academic Publishing. Professor Belgrave will speak for about 40 minutes or less, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I would like you to please post your questions in the Q&A function or save them for the talk itself, raise your hand, and we can have a conversation. It is my pleasure now to welcome to the HRC Dr. Faye Belgrave. Many of you know her, she needs no introduction, but I'll go ahead and introduce her nonetheless, who is University Professor of Psychology and the founding director of the Center for Cultural Experiences in Prevention at VCU. Many of us also know Dr. Belgrave as the Associate Dean for Equity and Community Partnerships in the College of Humanities and Sciences, and we are very grateful for all her work during the last year in the Dean's office. Dr. Belgrave received her PhD from the University of Maryland, her Master's of Science degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and her Bachelor's of Science from North Carolina A&T State University. She is the mother of 2 adult children, Angela and Alexander, and enjoys traveling to and being immersed in the culture of other countries. She also loves dancing and spending time with family and friends. Throughout her career, Dr. Belgrave has promoted health equity among African Americans and other undeserved populations through programs conducted in collaboration with community-based organizations. An international expert on African and African American psychology, Dr. Belgrave is the co-author of the first textbook on African American psychology. Her many books, papers, and talks challenge the dominant narrative of at-risk African Americans by focusing on resiliency fostered by African-centered values. Dr. Belgrave's work considers how historical and contemporary influences have shaped the culture and lived experiences of African Americans in the United States. She has received numerous awards and recognition for her work, her research, teaching, and service, including recently a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association, the Association of Black Psychologists Distinguished Faculty Award, an Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia, an Outstanding Alumna Award from North Carolina A&T State University, among many others. Please help me welcome Dr. Belgrave to the Humanities Research Center this afternoon, and many congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christina, for inviting me to talk about African American families today. It's a topic, of course, that's close to my heart, and I appreciate the opportunity. Also, I just want to give a shout out to my co-authors. Heather Jones is in psychology here at VCU, but was unable to join us today because of her schedule. And Trinette Clark Goins, who is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill and also was a student at VCU. So a lot of VCU represented in this presentation. So I hope to provide just an appreciation for the diversity of African-American families, and importantly to us as educators and teachers and researchers is understand how what we know about African-American families can perhaps help us better meet the needs of our African-American students. So let's stop this for a second and just ask you if you would write in the chat box, what does family mean to you? So what does, when you think about family, let's just take maybe 1 minute, and I want to see some text in the chat box. So what does family mean to you? Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, support, a unit of love, support, respect, understanding, trips across the country, togetherness, support, love, security, acceptance. So thank you for those comments. So we get a sense of support and togetherness. And I think the very first security, and belongingness, safety, people who are committed to each other's well-being is what we think about when we think about family. Now, unconditional love and support. Now I want you to think about, when you think about African-American families, what comes to mind? So let's take a moment and write that in the chat box. Resilient, having your back, strong faith, strong commitment, strength, community. Okay. Other thoughts? Okay. Mom's cooking. Thank you. Good food and fun. Thank you. The reason I asked this question is about blended. Yeah, someone put blended. I think about maybe 10, 11 years ago, I gave a guest lecture in a class for a psychology faculty colleague. And I asked that question. And then recently I asked that question. And so at this event, okay, excuse me, one sec. My light just went off and I want to turn it back on. So at this particular event, I asked what African-American family meant, and I was told by more than one student, it means poverty, living in low resource housing. Of course, that was the word that was used. Single parent households, and so forth and so on. And yeah, there is a higher percentage of African-American children who, not a higher percentage, about 50% of African-American children do grow up in single parent households, but not an overwhelming majority. And I think oftentimes people don't understand that demographic. African-American families, as we'll talk about, is very, very diverse. And that's one thing I want people to understand as we talk about African-American families today. African-American families are not always embedded in poverty and struggle and conflict. We certainly do experience a lot of disparities, but there is a lot of strength and resiliency among African-American families. I recently gave a talk about critical race theory, and we talked a little bit about racial disparities. And one of the participants from the audience said, the reason why there are so many disparities is because only 12% of African-American people get married. And that was said as a fact. So again, we continue to see lots of myths, lots of gross inaccuracies about who comprise African-American families, the structure, the function of African-American families. So that was one of the reasons we wrote the book. We really wanted to talk about the attributes of African-American families. I'm going to share my screen again. And capture some of the strengths of African-American families. So, for example, we want to share how African-American families have survived and excelled in an environment and in a nation that was not established for them. We want to capture experiences of African-American families in this country, from enslavement to Black Lives Matter. Importantly, we want to provide recommendations for how we can improve the lives of African-American families based on what we researched in this book. And so we wrote this book primarily as a text for students, but also for teachers and practitioners and researchers and anyone who work with and care about African-American children and families. And so this just shows you the diversity of African-American families that is portrayed throughout the book. Just kind of briefly, we know that Black immigrants are comprising a sizable amount of African-American families at this point in time. We know that there's diversity in terms of who is head of the household, with grandmothers sometimes being head of the household. There are African-American same-sex couples raising children, African-American fathers, also 1 out of every 5 newlyweds now are interracially married. We still have single mother-headed households, teen mothers, and everything in between. So the point here is that African-American families are very, very diverse and not monolithic. So this just gives you an idea of how we structured the textbook and the different chapters of the book. I don't think I need to go through this, but just to say that we really try to make sure that each chapter linked current practices among African Americans to perhaps practices since enslavement and during other periods in history, as well as some linkages to some of the cultural practices in Africa. So we know that, as I've just pointed out, African-American families are quite diverse, yet there are some shared and unique culturally distinct characteristics that can be shared among African-American families in this country. So I provide a definition of African-American or Black based on the US Census. Ancestry and any of the Black racial groups of Africa. It includes people who indicate their race as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or provide written entries such as Nigerian, Haitian, and Kenyan. So it's a pretty broad definition of African-Americans. So let's talk a little bit about the unique features of African-American families, because we talk about commonalities, and then we're going to talk about some diversity also. And all of this is in the first chapter of the book. So I just thought that might be interesting to look at. African-American families tend to be extended families. I think someone put that in the chat box. Someone put blended families, I think. So this means that there is a group of people or network of people who are functionally related, meaning having some level of functionality within a household, and they may reside in the same or in different households. So the concept of the African-American extended family, of course, has its roots from Africa. So in Africa, the family is an extended family where African communal values of interdependence, mutual aid, and concern and care for others' well-being are expressed. So you see this communal aspect of African-American families derived from African culture. So within African-American family networks, there tends to be not just immediate family members, but also extended members. Sometimes family, friends, and church members are included. The diversity in the living arrangements will go beyond marriage or parenthood and include many people outside the immediate household. Some of you have heard the term fictive kin, so we often see that in African-American families. So a fictive kin is a person who is not biologically related or related through marriage, but who feel and function as if they are related. So a lot of folks feel that fictive kin also emulated from African culture. And if you've ever been to many of the African countries and talk to people and they will say, well, this is my sister or my uncle. And I'm thinking, well, you only have 2 biological brothers or sisters, when in fact, what is going on here, people are connecting to other people as if they are their relative or their kin. So that's one feature of African-American families. So another one is this level of frequent interaction and exchange of goods and services. So there tends to be strong interactional patterns where people see each other often. Sometimes people are more likely to live in the same community, in the same household, but generally a stronger pattern of living closer together. This may extend to members of an extended family attending the same place of worship, and so forth and so on. We also know it extends to financial resources. So if one family member has the financial means, often that is the person who will help other members of the family financially. We see this extended also to care of others in need, even if they're not necessarily immediate family members. Sometimes extended family members are assumed within one's own sense of care and responsibilities. And we know from the research that families of color, including African-American families, are more likely to be caregivers relative to white families. There does seem to be a greater dislike for institutionalizing parents and elderly relatives among African-American families relative to other racial and cultural groups. Another feature of African-American family is this sense of informal adoption and kinship care. And so we see African-American families more likely to adopt informally children whose biological parents may not be able to take care of them. It's pretty prevalent. Sometimes it involves taking on a relative's child, or and sometimes it extends to also helping out with an elderly relative. So you see it at both ends, but typically there is much more informal adoption and kin caring for children among African American families relative to other racial and cultural groups. And so also there's a really strong religious orientation among African American families, with African Americans being highly religious, with about 88% belonging to some denomination and also participating in religious services pretty frequently. So we'll move on and talk a little bit about diversity. I'm not going to talk about all of these topics, but African American fathers also show resiliency and strengths. As such, does African American grandparents. I think one of the challenges of being an African American grandparent often is raising a child at the same time that they may be getting older and or maybe having some chronic concerns themselves. I'm going to move down and spend a little bit more time talking about African American immigrant families and African American LGBTQ plus families. So I want to talk a little bit about Black immigrant families, because we really see some strong shifts in the demographics of Blacks in this country. So about 9%, close to 10% of Black immigrants now comprise the Black population in this country. And much of the growth of the Black immigrant population has been from Africa. Among the Black immigrants, Haiti and Nigeria and Jamaica were the top 3 countries in which Black immigrants came from. And so what does this mean? It does have implications for kind of understanding the family dynamics and also achievement, I think. So when we think about family dynamics, for example, Black immigrant parents tend to be much more structured, rigid, and in this country, we might use the word controlling, although that's probably not the best word to use. So often the children of immigrant parents tend to achieve at a greater level than African American children in this country. That seemed to be lost by the second generation, where these differences sort of disappear. But it has some implications for how we educate Black students at VCU and in higher education. Sometimes what we see is the gains that we might see for immigrant children are sometimes lost if there's this cultural conflict between children who are in an American culture and parents who are wanting their children to do certain things culturally familiar. And so we sometimes see some reactance and some acting out. But overall, we do tend to see better academic outcomes among Black immigrant children relative to African American children. And just a few words about LGBTQ plus families, because I thought that was really interesting, and that's included in the book. Information is pretty sparse. There's not a lot of information on LGBTQ plus families. What we found was about 8% of African American households have a member of a same-sex couples, and African American same-sex couples do tend to raise children more so than other racial and ethnic groups. It was very challenging to find any information on trans families. So it's a lot left to be done in that area. And I just hope, as we continue to develop programs and think about African American families, that we think about these very diverse families that we don't typically think about, but for sure, we are seeing a fair number of same-sex couples raising children. However, we see very little information. I did a very thorough search of the research to see what I could find about trans families, and there was very little that I could find. And so we know that families impact African-American students, African-American children. Well, all families will have an impact on mental and physical health, emotional health, well-being, and also physical health, right? Social and peer relationships, how people get along with others, how they communicate with others through their religious, they impact their religious and moral values and conduct. And certainly families impact academic and vocational well-being. And so this is through many processes. We know families, for example, African-American families engage in this process called racial socialization. And what we mean by racial socialization is that parents teach their children what it means to be Black in this country, right? So they talk to their children, parents talk to their Black sons. I have a son and a daughter, so I would tell my son, you know, you cannot engage in certain behaviors because you're going to be profiled. So that's, you will be discriminated against. At the same time, we racially socialize our children to have racial pride. So I took my son to cultural events, Kwanzaa festivals and things of the like. So we find that when Black parents racially socialize their children, it tends to attenuate the discrimination that's inevitable, because we know that people are going to subject Black people to discrimination and oppression and racism in this country. But if parents can racially socialize their children, that discrimination does not appear to be as impactful. So we also know that parents can affect these outcomes, especially academic outcomes, by setting high expectations. And the research suggests that African-American parents do set high expectations for their children. And certainly by providing their children with unconditional love and support and affirmation, or ways, and these are just a few ways in which parents are able to directly and indirectly impact the well-being of their children across many, many domains. So I'm going to stop here and just look at the chat box.
Sure. There are some questions trickling in.
Okay.
Those of you who'd like to ask questions, please post them in the Q&A so we can separate them from, the other exercises or the comments. And I also wanted to acknowledge that this is probably our first event where we have almost the same number of attendees as registrants. So it's one of the first events where we have 30 some attendees who also registered. So thank you so much for showing up. A shout out to Kevin Harris, the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Medicine, who just made a very nice comment in the chat box. And also I'd like to welcome our Dean in the College of Humanities and Sciences, Jennifer Mallett. Faye, would you like to go ahead and answer Christopher Brooks's question? You have mentioned the religious part of the African-American family experience. Many of the children of this generation identify as religious nuns, meaning that they do not have a religious background or affiliation. What impact do you believe that will have on the future of African-American families? Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher, for that question. And I will say that religiosity has been a strength of African-American families, as we all know, and it's, pretty much has been so instrumental in moving us since enslavement but even before enslavement. Now, I will say that religiosity has declined among young adults, yet, and I'm not 100% sure of this stat, but I'm thinking that relative to other racial and ethnic groups, young African-American adults are still relatively religious. I think we might be at about around 79%. It's in the book. It's in the book. I can't remember all the stats, but yeah, I think you are right, Christopher. I do think that the fundamental core to African-American has been the strong religious tradition. But at the same time, let's look at other kinds of ways in which African-American young adults might be able to achieve a sense of well-being and purpose. And I think because we are seeing some circular things coming back, like Black Lives Matter. And I think the advocacy that many of our young people are showing now may sort of coexist with some of the strong religious orientations we've seen in the past.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Kevin Harris. Wonderful research, quite timely. He says, I'm curious and would like to hear more about the impact of absent fathers on the Black family and the need for trauma-informed models to address related issues that surface in African-American children.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think my research showed, first of all, that African-American fathers who did not live in the household was still communicating and being fathers to their children. So I think that's somewhat of a myth that African-American fathers are absent. They are not necessarily living in the household, but relative to other racial ethnic groups, there really was no difference. In fact, in terms of childcare and coming and feeding the child and reading to the child and so forth. Actually, African-American fathers were more involved, actually. And I think I saw another study just recently that came out. So I think we have to think about what does it mean to be absent. Not living in a household does not necessarily mean that you're an absent father. Now, I would agree that, it is going to be a bit more challenging to raise a child in a single parent household if you don't have support from another person. And so one thing that the research has shown is that if there is another supported adult in the house, be an aunt, a grandmother, there's really no difference in functional outcomes of children who are raised in these households, unlike other racial ethnic groups. So if you're raised in a household with a supportive adult and with the father who may not be in the household, but who may be in communication and with the child, then some of the outcomes are not as bad as people have traditionally thought. On the other hand, I do think, when parents are not together to deal with some of the issues that our Black children are facing, that's when trauma-informed care could certainly, we could certainly benefit from. I guess that's the way I would say that. I can't get feedback to see whether or not
Thank you for that. We'll see if there's a follow-up question. We have our next question is from Charlene Crawley. Thank you so much for your question, Charlene. She asks, are there significant differences in how African-American families from other nations, from the African continent or from Haiti or different ethnicities, Latino, Hispanic, for instance, relate to African-American families of the diaspora?
Yeah, I think there have been some differences across different ancestries and different groups. I think that those differences tend to dissipate by, the second, third generation. Because keep in mind, when people come from other countries, there are some cultural values, and whereas I would say that there are many cultural values found among African Americans that emulate from an African diaspora, there are still some real cultural differences. And, one definitely has to do with this whole notion of parental autonomy, right? Which is going to be stronger from those countries than from the US. So there are those differences. And I think it can produce differences in how people engage and communicate with each other. And so I think it's something that we need to be aware of as faculty and as researchers. And that's why it's so important. There's the survey of Black Americans that most people know about with Dr. Jackson, who's not so long ago died, that really talks about some of these differences between African Americans and Blacks from other countries.
Thank you for that answer. We have a question from our colleague, Jesse Goldstein in sociology. Thanks for this presentation. He says, is there a part of this research that deals with ancestors and deceased members of the family?
Yeah, wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because that is really part of that African tradition. And oftentimes our ancestors are part of, and I say our because I feel that myself personally, that our ancestors are part of our families, and that is definitely part of African culture. And there's a saying that I often say that as long as one person remembers the name of the deceased, that person will live forever, right? But ancestor and the importance and the veneration of all living people, the dead, if you study African culture and religion, the veneration of the dead and the living is important in African culture. And I think to a certain extent, some of that has translated to Africans in this country.
Thank you so much for the question and for your answer, Dr. Belgrave. You've started your talk today by addressing some of these myths, but I think this is a pertinent question. Susan Gooden asks, well, first of all, she says outstanding research, so just passing this along. What do you think is most misunderstood and underappreciated about Black families?
Yeah, I really do think it's this myth of Black families being living in poverty, the single mother headed household, the misunderstanding of the diversity of Black families. I would say that's the most, that's the myths that seems to be most relevant in my mind, at least.
Thank you for that answer. Connected to Susan's question, there is a question from Elsie Harper Anderson. She says, you mentioned how many view African-American families. Do you think that social media, where people share parts of their lives that were unseen before, has had an impact on shaping a different picture of African-American families? And I don't know if you deal with this specifically in the book, but I'm sure it's something you think about quite a lot.
Yeah, I do think social media has had a pretty profound impact on families and who people think about when they think about families, because it's just opened up a whole new, and I'm not sure it's positive or negative, but it's just opened up a whole new world of people who are now included as significance, right? Whereas before, things were much more geographically located. So yeah, I would agree that social media has had an impact on shaping a different picture of African-American families. I think we have to wait and see a bit because there is this close interaction and exchange of information, resources, But at the same time, I think social media impact is certainly real. Yeah.
Thank you so much. One more question from Charlene Crowley. Are there specific strategies or guidelines that we as faculty should be aware when interacting with African-American students or students of mixed heritage? And secondly, have stereotypes held for these students differently from those held of students with two Black parents or international Black families and so forth?
Let me see. Let me go to what was the first part of the question again?
The first part is whether you have recommendations or are there specific strategies or guidelines that faculty should be aware of when interacting with African-American students of mixed heritage?
Yeah, I do think the guidelines are, first of all, to understand the diversity among African-American students, also to understand the importance of the family in the expectations and in the performance of African-American children. For example, we did some interviews with African-American males in the college, and many wanted to do well because they did not want to disappoint their mother. It's like, I got to do well because if I don't, my parents are going to be really, really upset with me. So I think we have to understand how to maybe engage the parents in the education about Black children, especially, well, in this case, it was Black males. So I think that's a real important consideration in terms of what we can do. In terms of the stereotypes, yeah, there are some stereotypes that unfortunately continue to exist about African-American students not being prepared. Yeah, and I mean, you hear it all the time. And what I think happens though, sometimes it's like making a positive out of a negative. I think sometimes this sense of I am being portrayed and stereotyped as a Black male. So I'm going to show them. I'm going to show them that I am strong, I am resilient, I am smart. So sometimes it actually works the other way, in the sense that African Americans are more likely to perhaps even perform at a higher level because they want to defy those stereotypes.
Thank you so much for answering these questions. If you have other questions, please post them in the Q&A or raise your hand. And in the meantime, I have a couple of questions, if you'll indulge me, Faye, just about the conception of the book, just about the writing of the book, because we meet authors here at Meet VCU authors from various fields who employ different methods, right, for different audiences sometimes. And I'm just fascinated with collaborative research and writing, as somebody in a traditionally one author type of field. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the genealogy of this project, how it started. You mentioned that it's a textbook. If maybe some schools have adopted it, or is there talk of maybe adopting it here at VCU? And then tell us a little bit about this collaborative project and any of the exciting parts about writing together, any sort of wow moments coming out.
Writing is it's a lonely process. Those of us who have written textbooks, and this was my second one, African American Psychology, is in its fourth edition, and it's because it's not like writing a research paper, right? Where your paper, your research, right? You know what you do. When you write a textbook, you really have to incorporate research. And more importantly, you also have to leave the reader with some recommendations. So we started out, I was asked to do a book on a topic I wanted to, and I thought African-American families, but I knew as a health, community, social psychologist, I did not have the background to cover all of the units and all of the chapters. So I invited Heather Jones, who is a child clinical psychologist, who could take the lead on those chapters related to mental health of African American children as a co-author, and also Trinette Clark Goins is a social worker. And as a social worker, she thinks very differently in terms of systems approaches, such as the child welfare system and African American grandparents. So it was sort of exciting because we three brought different perspectives. And when we got together, there was that synergy of the contributions of each of the co-authors. So
did this collaborative process change your mind about or some of the assumptions you were making about any of the topics? That were there any sort of revelations that came out of this, collective reviewing and writing of the book?
Well, I mean, the other thing, let me share that we did invite a couple of graduate students to co-author, including a couple of graduate students at VCU. There's a chapter on African American religion, for example, and there was a doctoral student who was doing work on African American religion, Afonso. So we invited him to co-author that chapter with me. So that was really, a really pleasant experience, because I got a chance to sort of work with the doctoral student in a topic that he was so passionate about. And those of you who know me know I'm really interested in African religion. So I was able to see his perspective and how a lot of the traditions of religion that African American, even with Christianity, really emulated from Africa. And then also we got to see the diversity of African religions: Seventh-day Adventists, Muslim, Jehovah's Witnesses. African American, even though these are smaller religious groups, African Americans comprise a fairly substantial percentage of these religious groups. And to just understand that when Africans were forced into this country, there were quite a few Muslims, so it's not new. And so that was a real exciting chapter for me. And I worked with another person on another chapter called African Americans in Urban Environments. And this person named Tammy had actually been a faculty at VCU in the Department of Sociology and had taught in sociology for a few years. And so that was really exciting also, to be able to work with someone with expertise in an area that I would not consider expertise.
Thank you for that. Christopher Brooks, you are on live.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Faye, thank you for this wonderful work. But I had a question that was related to Susan's. And it's that those stories that are most often told are the ones that tend to be negative, someone being impoverished or being gang affiliated or something like that. And as a result of the frequency of those kinds of stories being told, do you believe that they help to perpetuate the myth?
Absolutely. And we see them all the time. They're implicit, right? They're not explicit. We see the myth all the time, and we see it in the media. I was talking to another faculty, and the assumption was, in a sort of a condescending way, I'll say, those poor children, and I wanted to say those poor children probably have more agility than many of us at navigating the world around them. So, and I mean, that's the perspective I've used in all the books I've written. It's always, let's start out with recognizing the strengths, right? Instead of looking at the negative, because you're absolutely right. People go straight. And, I'm a health disparity researcher. I know there are disparities. There's disparities across the board. These disparities are because of racism and discrimination. And at the same time, we see so many children and youth and families who have survived in spite of these disparities, right? So I think that's the important message, is that, I mean, how could a people survive and thrive through the brutal, dehumanizing, oppressive conditions? And the fact that we are still standing speaks volumes, and standing tall and strong in many cases. Thank you for the question, Christopher.
Thank you. Thank you both. I don't see any other questions. Anita and Adal, just, parting words, wonderful presentation. Thank you all. If you still have questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I think, Christopher, did you have another question, or is this?
It's more of a comment, and I'm sorry to dominate, but Faye, also thank you for using the term enslavement and enslavement experience as opposed to what is often used, slave and slavery. I appreciate that you have taken the time to make that distinction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you for making that wonderful distinction. Michelle Pope has a final question for you, Faye. What challenges, if any, have you faced with respect to buy-in and uptake of your textbook? Any pushback? Have you modified your approach from previous editions? I think this is the first edition.
Yeah,
right?
the one in the fourth edition is African American psychology. So far, I don't know what the challenges are. Up until this point, there was no authored textbook in African American families. So even though there are three of us and we had a couple of the chapters co-authored, there was no sort of integrated standalone textbook that we felt could be used in a semester-long course. And at the same time, we were hopeful that people who like social workers or teachers might find the book useful. So I think it's relatively new adoptions because it was published last spring. So we'll know more about the adoptions this fall and henceforth. It is also very interdisciplinary, but I do think overly weighed probably with psychology because two of us are psychologists and one of us is a social worker. So we'll see what the challenges might be by the time we get ready for the second edition and we get feedback on the use. We want it used in courses in African American studies and psychology and education. In social work, I know it has been adopted, and especially in social work. Yeah, those are the types of courses we would like to see it adopted.
Wonderful. I think these are all the questions. Yeah, just making sure one more time. Thank you so much, Faye, and congratulations on the publication of your book. Thank you so much for making time to speak with us today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. And thank you, the audience, for joining us on this rainy day, but also very exciting afternoon. Just a few announcements before we go today. Our next event in Meet VCU Authors Series will be exactly 1 week from today, November 1st, just in time for the election season. We'll welcome Dr. Alex Kina, Assistant Professor of Political Science at VCU, who will be in dialogue with Dr. Michael Latner, Professor of Political Science at Cal Poly, and they will speak about their recent book on a very timely and important topic, Gerrymandering the States, Partisanship, Race, and the Transformation of American Federalism, published this July by Cambridge University Press. Looking ahead to November, we have two great events to kick off the Native American Heritage Month. On November the 11th at 6 p.m., we'll welcome one of my personal heroes, Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, whose talk is entitled, quote, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and the History of Erasure and Exclusion. And on November the 18th, we'll welcome both in person and virtually. This will be our first HRC hybrid event. We'll welcome Choctaw writer and University of Georgia Eidson Distinguished Professor Leanne Howe, who will read from a recent book titled Savage Conversations. I look forward to seeing many of you and your students at these events, and many thanks to you all for supporting the HRC. Thanks again to Professor Belgrave. A recording of this event will be posted on our website in the next few weeks. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.